Thank you. And really, I'd like to thank Pete and the Initiative for Public Choice and Market Process for inviting me here tonight to talk to you, and thank you for coming to hear me talk to you about entrepreneurship. And you know, I almost feel like me talking about entrepreneurship to you is a bit of a letdown, because I operate under a certain disability. I am, as Pete indicated to you in my bio, I am by training a philosopher. And so you might say, good God, what does a philosopher know about entrepreneurship? And the correct answer to that is, of course, too little, right? Nonetheless, I hope I know enough about entrepreneurship to say something that is of at least potential interest to you. Perhaps the fact that I approach this discussion of entrepreneurship from a philosophical perspective might mean that you come to view entrepreneurship in a slightly different way. That is, the way you think about entrepreneurship coming into the room may not be the same way that you think of entrepreneurship coming out of the room. And so I have to tell you, I'm not just a philosopher, I'm an academic, because I believe that at root, ideas have consequences. I don't think you could in good faith undertake an academic career if you didn't believe that ideas have consequences. That is, ideas change the world. Or as I like to tell my students, how you think about something will not change what it is. It remains what it is regardless of how you think about it. However, how you think about something changes what that thing can become. Right? Now this is not a foreign idea to us. I hope it's not. Certainly, it's not an idea that's original to me. Deirdre McCloskey, in her recent book, Bourgeois Dignity, effectively tells us, right, that it was by virtue in Western Europe of us changing the way we thought about commerce. Thinking at first that it was dirty, grubby activity that only a less dignified person could engage in, to thinking instead that commerce, that trade, might be one of the reasons why, or one of the ways in which human beings can demonstrate, as we are taught in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that human beings are made in God's image, right? So God in Genesis is a creator. Right? When we start thinking about trade, when we start thinking about commerce as being a creative form of activity, right, it gains, or it generates a certain dignity that it lacked before. And McCloskey's thesis is that it is this, rather than what we think of as ordinary economizing, marginal reasoning type behavior, that explains the growth of the West, right? So McCloskey's book is just one particular demonstration of the idea that ideas have consequences. And so I want to get at why the idea of entrepreneurship is important and why we should think about entrepreneurship, make it an object of study and of cognition, by way of my friend Nick Capaldi. Because my friend Nick Capaldi, he is the Legendre Soule Distinguished Professor of Business Ethics at Loyola University, New Orleans. Capaldi says that entrepreneurship, that business, that commerce, that trade ends up being very important in what he sees as the human project of modernity, right? Modernity being basically everything coming out of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all the rest. What Capaldi sees as the fundamental project of modernity is what he calls the technological project. The technological project is the idea that nature, rather than being an organism, is instead a mechanism, right? And the ancient idea was that the appropriate life for a human being was to fit oneself into nature such that one could gain what nature gave to you. And so the idea of agriculture, right, is to conform your activities to the way the sun rises and falls, to the seasons, in order to get the maximum bounty of food that can be generated through agricultural activity, right? But with the Renaissance, Renaissance, right? But with the Enlightenment comes the idea that, wait a minute, nature is actually something that we can study. Through investigations in the natural and in the physical sciences, we can come to understand the laws of nature, the mechanisms by which they operate. And by understanding those mechanisms, we can manipulate nature for human benefit. Or, in the words of Descartes, we can make ourselves, through the acquisition of knowledge in the natural and the physical sciences, masters and possessors of nature, right? We can use nature as a tool. We can use nature as a resource for human betterment. This is put much more succinctly, albeit in Latin, by Sir Francis Bacon when he says, "Scientia potentia est," knowledge is power. You, living your entire lives in a society which is imbued with the technological project, are probably sitting there right now saying, well, duh. Of course we're supposed to use nature for human benefit. Of course we want pharmaceuticals that will lengthen lives. Of course we want the benefits of technology like iPhones and iPads and laptop computers and Wi-Fi and all of the rest. But at the dawn of modernity, this was actually a relatively radical idea. It was overthrowing the ancient order. And so I want to suggest that entrepreneurship actually plays a very important role in our attempts to pursue the technological project. That is the project of manipulating nature for human benefit through acquiring and applying knowledge in the natural and the physical sciences. And the way this happens, according to Professor Capaldi, or one explanation of the way this happens is what Professor Capaldi calls the Lockean, or I will call it, because it's Adam Smith week, the Locke-Smith liberty narrative, right? Now, I don't gratuitously include Smith in this just to make Pete happy because it's Adam Smith week. Actually, I call it the Locke-Smith narrative because Locke, John Locke, is the initiator of this narrative, particularly in the second treatise on government. However, this narrative reaches its apotheosis. It reaches its apotheosis in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? The best way I can think of in order to explain the Locke-Smith liberty narrative is this. The Locke-Smith liberty narrative says that the commercial republic, the combination of a republican form of government involving both popular sovereignty and a limitation on government in the forms of rights of citizens and things like that, with commerce as the principal means by which people acquire the things that they use to make their lives, this politico-economic arrangement is, in the Locke-Smith liberty narrative, the ideal way to pursue the technological project. So in effect, if we want the fruits of the technological project, if we wish to live happier, healthier, and wealthier lives, if we wish to have iPads and iPhones, if we wish to live longer through science and through pharmaceuticals and whatnot, we need to pursue the technological project in the most effective way possible. The Locke-Smith liberty narrative says that this evolved politico-economic institution that we call the commercial republic is the best way to go about doing it. I like to characterize Locke and Smith as offering what is, in effect, an owner's manual for a commercial republic. They say, in effect, congratulations on your purchase of a commercial republic. It will give you decades, nay centuries, of trouble-free use as long as you remember these 5 rules. Throw out the bums at regular intervals, and, well, there are probably 4 more. All right. So what does this narrative say? It says that the technological project is best pursued in a free market economy. And what we mean by a free market economy is basically 2 things. The free operation of the price system. That's one component of it. And the other is the free operation of the profit and loss system. Through the joint but free operation of the price system and of the profit and loss system, we come to discover 2 things. One thing that we discover is which are the products, which are the goods, which are the services that best conduce to human well-being. The thought is, of course, that the things that command the highest prices in the market, right, conduce in some important way to human well-being. The profit and the loss system identify for us which firms, which entrepreneurs, which collections of individuals, right, are doing the best job of providing these things with the least use of resources in order to get them, right? So the thought is, things that conduce to human betterment are going to command good prices in the marketplace. Firms that are good at making those things, right, are going to thrive and flourish and grow. Firms that are not good at making those things are going to shrink and wither and go bankrupt, right? So what the first step of this locksmith liberty narrative is the idea that if we want the fruits of the technological project, we should have a free market economy. The free operation of the price and of the profit and loss systems. However, we can't have a free market economy. We can't have a free market economy, there we go, unless we have a political regime marked by limited government. This shouldn't be a revolutionary thought. At the very least, in order for the price and the profit and loss systems to operate freely, government would have to be limited in its ability to intervene in the operation of the price system and in the operation of the profit and loss system. So take things like bailouts for politically favored firms, right? This would be a no-no in the locksmith narrative. Why? Because it undermines the operation and the informational content of the profit and loss systems, which indicate which things and which firms conduce to human benefit, right? But we can't have limited government, says the locksmith liberty narrative, unless we have the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is a complex notion. Indeed, I could spend a whole lecture, perhaps 7 lectures, on what all is built into the rule of law. However, I want to focus on just one aspect of the rule of law that is important here. And this is the idea of law consisting mainly, if not exclusively, of general and abstract rules of conduct. If you think about it, law in a liberal legal order is a remarkable thing. It's remarkable because of what it assumes about human beings. Right? When law is presented to you in the form of general and abstract rules, it suggests that you are capable of recognizing in your own life circumstances to which the law applies, circumstances to which the law is relevant. It assumes that you are able to identify the relevant aspects of the situation that you are in and then apply the law to them, and having done that, conform your behavior or conform your activity to what the law demands. In other words, the rule of law is premised upon a relatively thick conception of the human person. The human person is cognitively complex, right, and is able, rather than being governed by direct commands or prohibitions, but is able to govern him or herself by rules. Which brings us to the last dependency that Capaldi, in laying out the locksmith liberty narrative, sees, which is that we cannot have a rule of law order unless we live in a culture of personal autonomy. And so the autonomous person, right, the autonomous person is the person who is capable of leading a self-directed life. Now, that's not the same as just doing whatever you want, because if you do whatever you want, you are not free, you are not autonomous, you are a slave. You are a slave to the passions. If you think about Immanuel Kant's conception of the human person, the idea that we as human beings are not merely able, through the evidence of our senses, we're not merely able, through the evidence of our senses, to apprehend the world as it is, but we are able, through affirmative acts of imagination, to imagine the world being different than it is. And we can imagine the world being different in many different ways. And then, on the basis of reasons, Note, not necessarily desires, not necessarily passions. We can endorse some ways in which the world can be different, and we can reject other ways in which the world can be different. And for the ways that we endorse, we can then marshal resources and move our bodies in order to make what we imagine real. I imagine that just by virtue of the fact that you are here at College of Charleston, you're doing this. You've imagined the world being different than it is in some way. And as a result of doing that, right, you've endorsed on the basis of reasons the world being different in that way. Right? And then you're moving your body and you're marshaling resources in order to make that real. Why am I so confident that you're doing that? I'm confident that you're doing that. Why am I confident of that fact?
Because we're here to get a degree.
You're here to get a degree. You imagined a state of the world. It might just be a state of the world in which you have a degree. Right? It might be a state of the world in which you're doing something else entirely, but in order to do that, you have to have a degree, right? You endorsed on the basis of reasons that imagined state of the world. It's not real, but you've imagined it, right? And now you're moving your body, at the very least, to class or to events like this. I know you're beginning to rethink that decision, aren't you? And with good reason, right? You're marshaling resources, at the very least financial ones, right, in order to make this state of the world in which you have a degree real. Right? This is what happens in a culture of personal autonomy, right? We venerate and we celebrate the ability of people to direct their lives on the basis of reasons for human betterment and human fulfillment. So we can't have the rule of law, that system in which we apply to people general and abstract rules of conduct as they go about pursuing whatever it is that they value, says the locksmith liberty narrative, unless we are operating in a culture of personal autonomy. And so this is the chain of dependencies. I like to think of it as a set of concentric circles, each one showing on what the various things depend. So the technological project depends, says the locksmith liberty narrative, on a free market economy, which depends upon limited government, which depends upon the rule of law, which depends at root on a culture of personal autonomy. If you've got these things, says the locksmith liberty narrative, you will be able to pursue the technological project to the fullest. If you have different institutions or you have a different type of culture, you're going to be less successful in enjoying the fruits of the technological project, right? So you say, well, all right, that's a great story. I can tell that you're a philosopher. You really care about intellectual history and ideas that have come down. But what does this liberty narrative coming from Locke and coming from Adam Smith, what does it have to do with entrepreneurship? Actually, it has everything to do with entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur in this narrative is a very important person. First, the entrepreneur emerges. The entrepreneur emerges as the ideal pursuer of the technological project. Now that may be a strange idea for you, because when you imagine technological breakthrough and technological accomplishment, maybe you imagine a scientist, you imagine a physicist, you imagine somebody in a white lab coat making a discovery. That's undoubtedly part of the process. But the way we get from the technological discovery to the ability of that technological discovery to improve human lives is by way of creating products that people can consume in order to lead happier, healthier, and wealthier lives. And so it is the entrepreneur organizing at some level of abstraction the activity or the output of scientific, of engineering, of technological discovery that actually makes effective the technological project in our lives. The second reason why the entrepreneur emerges as important is because the entrepreneur, at least in liberal, Western, capitalist cultures, is probably the ideal exemplar of a culture of personal autonomy. If asked to point to people in the world who are exemplars of personal personal autonomy. Who is autonomous? Who is leading an ideally autonomous life? We're going to be more likely, at least in Western capitalist type cultures, to point to entrepreneurs as exemplars of this self-directed, disciplined by reason type life that we're idealizing in this conception. Right? So that tells us why entrepreneurship is important. And so we could stop here and say, yay, entrepreneurship. And I could walk off the stage, and you could say, well, all right, Alexei, I've heard lots of people say yay entrepreneurship. We have a whole week devoted to saying yay entrepreneurship, right, Pete? Yeah, and so this would be a lousy place to stop. But why is there anything more to say than this? Am I now just trying to fill time between now and the end? No, I want to say there's more to say than yay entrepreneurship, because there's a problem with entrepreneurship. The problem is that entrepreneurship is a contested concept. Right? That is, although there is a great deal of agreement that entrepreneurship is important, when you ask people, what is this important thing that we're all agreeing on, you get answers that are all over the board. So, do people think entrepreneurship is important? Yes, they do. You can't walk into a business school now that doesn't say, we value entrepreneurship. Look at our entrepreneurship program. You know, look at how many new business startups we have had come out of this school, etc. No problem with celebrating entrepreneurship, at least in a business school environment, right? But when you ask people, well, what is entrepreneurship? Or what is it that these people who are doing all of these great things, what is it that they are doing that is entrepreneurial? Then you start getting answers all over the board. And so I guess what I want to suggest is that we shouldn't just stop with yay entrepreneurship. We should start saying with, well, what is it about entrepreneurship that makes it such a fecund, that makes it such a productive and useful thing? And so I want to point out the problem by adverting to only two prominent theories of entrepreneurship. I could advert to more, but I am limited in the time that I have to lay them out. That's thing number one. And thing number two, I only need to in order to make the basic point that I'm going to make. So here is a creepy painting of Joseph Schumpeter, right? It is amazing what you can find on Google Images if you try. I put Joseph Schumpeter in there. There were a bunch of photographs of him, and there was that. There was that. I love the Spock ears. Right? He looks like an alien trying to induce you to do something really awful. Right? I love this picture, and I use it in a course that I teach, in part because, at least in our current epoch, in our current day and age, Joseph Schumpeter, at least to the extent that you are thinking about entrepreneurship at all, Joseph Schumpeter controls your mind. And I've performed informal experiments in order to demonstrate this. One thing that I do with my ethics, economics, and entrepreneurship students at Loyola University Chicago, the first day is I give them a 3x5 card, I ask them to write their names on it, and I ask them to tell me in 2 or 3 sentences what entrepreneurship is. And then I collect the cards. And then I wait until later in the semester when we start talking about different theories of entrepreneurship. And usually 70, 80, 90% of the students, even if they've never encountered Schumpeter before, they give Schumpeterian accounts, Schumpeterian ideas of what entrepreneurship is. It's Joseph Schumpeter's world, and there it is over his shoulder. We merely live in it. Right? So what's Schumpeter's idea of entrepreneurship? For Schumpeter, entrepreneurship is essentially constituted, by the way, that painting, it was for sale. It was for sale when I looked it up on the internet. I'll bet it's still for sale now. I'm not sure why I'm confident of that. I'm confident of a good many things. I'm confident of that as well, right? Joseph Schumpeter's conception of entrepreneurship, right, is focused upon his concept of creative destruction. That too is a painting also for sale that was titled Creative Destruction, right? So for Schumpeter, the entrepreneurial element in human activity is a fundamentally creative one. It's a creative one. Generally, when we talk about entrepreneurship as involving innovation, and I know my students can't think more than 3 or 4 thoughts about entrepreneurship, or they can't articulate more than 3 or 4 thoughts when talking about entrepreneurship, then do they not eventually land on innovation? The idea for Schumpeter is that entrepreneurship is essentially constituted in creative activity, right? Creating something new from nothing. I like the picture because we see the idea of the candle inspiring the idea of the light bulb. Today we would not consider that creative or innovative, but when the light bulb was created, it was world-changing in the way Schumpeter was talking about. And so creative ideas are brought to market because of what we have seen in the last third of a century in the United States and in the Western world. We tend to think in pop Schumpeter terms that innovation means product innovation, new stuff. You know, I'm doing my presentation through my iPhone, something that would have been impossible 5 years ago, or if not impossible, at least extraordinarily difficult. Right? And so we tend to think in contemporary Western society, we tend to think of innovation as product innovation. But if you go back and you read Schumpeter, who was writing in the early 20th century, product innovation is only one kind of innovation. Another kind of innovation is what he would call process innovation. We make products like we made them before, but we do them through processes that are faster or are cheaper or are better in some way or more flexible. That too would be innovation in Schumpeter's sense. Another form of innovation that Schumpeter would recognize: we're selling the same product, we're making it by the same process, but we've identified a new market. We've identified a new market for a product. When we created the product, we never thought it would be saleable to these people or saleable to people who are engaged in this activity. But in effect, they engage in innovation in figuring out how to use our product. And we seek to capitalize on that in the market. But the big idea for Schumpeter is novelty, is newness. I mean, the root word of innovation is the Latin word novus, meaning new. Right? So we think of, if we're thinking in Schumpeterian terms, we think of entrepreneurship as involving newness. And not just any newness will do for Schumpeter, because it has to be newness that in an important way destroys the old order. And so I love this picture. I love this picture. I also hate this picture. I also hate this picture because I am of a certain age in which I actually enjoyed going to physical bookstores with coffee houses attached in order to find books. How? By browsing, not knowing what I was looking for or even that I was looking for anything, but happening to find it because that was a pleasurable experience. So if I'm shaking my fist at Amazon, I guess, right? So for Schumpeter, creative destruction is a fundamentally disruptive process. Right? If we think about the model of perfect competition that we get from neoclassical economics, in which we have a commodity product, low or no barriers to entry, many buyers, many sellers, perfect information, right? There's nothing really for an entrepreneur to do in such a market condition, but entrepreneurs come in and say, wait, it doesn't have to be a commodity product, right? We can actually sell at a very different price than our competitors. Why? Because we've engaged in process innovation, for example, or what have you. This sort of activity, this entrepreneurial activity, disrupts the relatively smooth operation of a competitive market. And so we have a picture in which the entrepreneur acts as a stone thrown in a placid pool. The placid pool is the market in equilibrium. The entrepreneur comes with his disruptive technology and overthrows the existing order. Eventually that innovation gets copied, right? And the market seeks to work toward a new equilibrium until what? Another entrepreneur comes along and disrupts it all. The thing that I want you to see is that in this story, the entrepreneur is someone who does something creative, does something that is relatively, at least relative to our model of the perfectly competitive market, which is a rough model of normalcy, does something that is uncommon. And this creative and uncommon thing disrupts the existing order. You say, all right, that is one, that is a very popular, that is a very overwhelmingly popular in our current epoch picture of entrepreneurship. But it is not the only picture of entrepreneurship. This is Israel Kirzner, right? Israel Kirzner gives a very different account of entrepreneurship. If you asked Kirzner who in the world is engaged in entrepreneurial activity, he would point to most, if not all, of the same people that Schumpeter would. But he'd point to many other people besides, right? Because Kirzner has a very different account of what entrepreneurship is. And so Kirzner's account of entrepreneurship is rooted in his teacher, Ludwig von Mises's account of human action. Now, I always think that it's strange that an economist in the middle part of the 20th century wrote a treatise on economics with the title Human Action. You wouldn't think that if you picked up a book with the title Human Action, it would be about economics. But Mises was dead serious. It is about that, because he says economic activity, and we're going to see entrepreneurial activity, has something very importantly in common with all human activity. And so Mises attempts to answer the question, why do human beings act? Why are human beings not forever at rest? Why do human beings up and do things? Right? Mises's answer is that they experience what he calls felt unease. Right? People feel uneasy. They sense that there is something wrong, or at the very least something that could be better, and that is what induces them to act. Right? And so I like to say that in Mises's account, people perceive a difference between what is and what could be. And so in the picture, I imagine the kitten perceiving the difference between what it is currently and what it could be, namely a lion, right? And so in this account of human action, you might perceive a difference between what is and what could be, such that what could be is better. And as a result of that, you create an action plan. You say, I'm going to try to bring about what's better. It's like you getting the degree. Right? You say, I perceive that I don't have a degree. I perceive that having a degree would be better than not having a degree. I've formed an action plan in order to create the state of affairs in which I have a degree. It also works the other way, though. You can perceive a difference between what is and what could be, in which what could be is worse than what is. Right? But nonetheless, this might induce you to action. Anyone who has ever purchased an insurance policy has done exactly that. You say, things are pretty good, but I could imagine them getting worse in some way. Perhaps I can insure against the contingency. The idea is that Kirzner says that his account of entrepreneurship is just a particular application of Mises's account of human action generally, right? Entrepreneurs are people who are alert, unlike the gentleman pictured, who are alert to these differences between what is and what could be, right? Kirzner has a term for these differences. He calls them opportunities. An entrepreneur is someone who is alert to opportunities. That is states of affairs that can be exploited for human gain, right? So what kinds of opportunities are going to interest entrepreneurs? The answer is opportunities to buy low and sell high, or what we call arbitrage, right? So pure arbitrage. You know, London gold is trading for $1 less than New York gold, and so you buy London gold and you sell New York gold. That's pure arbitrage. That would be an example, right? But most entrepreneurship doesn't involve just exploiting an instantaneous difference between two markets. It involves imagining a temporal and spatial, and perhaps spatial as well, difference between two markets. I imagine that resources put together today for $8 will sell tomorrow for $12. That is an opportunity. Right? So why do I point this out to you? I point this out to you because in this account, entrepreneurship is exploratory rather than creative. It's common. Everyone's doing it. The copycat entrepreneur is an entrepreneur for Kerzner. He is not for Schumpeter. Right? And also, it is harmonizing activity. Right? The role of the arbitrageur in the market is to bring about greater equilibrium or greater coordination in the market rather than disruption in the market. So we have these two almost diametrically opposed accounts of what it is that entrepreneurs are doing and why it matters. Right? And you say, well, all right, again, you are a philosopher. You find these intellectual puzzles inherently interesting. That's why you work in a university. Why should we care? Is there any practical or is there any political upshot to these two different ways of thinking about entrepreneurship? Because I'm running out of time, I'm going to give you one example. I'm going to say that depending upon whether you have, for example, a more Schumpeterian or a more Kerznerian picture of entrepreneurship, you will likely have very different views on how important intellectual property is. You say, well, why would that be? Why would you have different views of intellectual property, different views of whether or not through public policy we should promote the creation of and the protection of intellectual property? Well, if you have a Schumpeterian account of entrepreneurship, if you think it's creative and you think it's rare, you're going to think that it's going to be very important to arrange the carrots and sticks in your political economy such that people who have the capacity to engage in this creative action will have the incentives to actually do it. So your horror scenario is, here is someone in our society who has the capacity to engage in creative destruction of a sort that benefits us in the long run and all the rest. But your worry is this person does not have the relevant incentives to do it. And so this person becomes, I don't know, a university professor. Right? That's your horror scenario if you are a Schumpeterian. Right? But if you're a Kerznerian, you might say, wait a minute, an intellectual property regime might actually get in the way of what it is that really pushes us forward. What pushes us forward is not that people of rare creative insight have the incentives to come to market. It's that the way problems get solved, the way human beings end up living happier, healthier, and wealthier lives is instead that a bunch of people, a bunch of different people, right? Smart or not, creative or not, insightful or not, try to solve a problem. Try to conceptualize a problem and then solve it. Or try to conceptualize a solution that no one's recognized as a problem. And eventually, through the process of many people trying, and most of them failing, right? Nonetheless, we hit upon a solution and we're moved forward. We're moved forward in living happier, healthier, and wealthier lives. If that's your picture of how innovation occurs, it's a trial and error process, you're going to have a worry about strong intellectual property rights. It's going to dissuade people from engaging in the trial and error process for fear of, if they're successful, being appropriated from by people who did it first, or what have you. And so, just with these two different, both very influential accounts of entrepreneurship, you see already we have very different ideas about what public policy should look like in a Western, liberal, capitalist political economy. Right? So I want to leave you with the idea that ideas have consequences, including entrepreneurial ones. And with that, I am done and ready to take questions, comments, or hoots of derision. Yes, sir.
I'm glad you mentioned McCluskey, because I was thinking about her also. Embracing motherliness and finding dignity in commerce. So I wanted to ask you about how you regard emergence of guilds. They're often presented as forebringers of the bourgeois development of society. They also offered opportunities for a certain kind of motherliness because of the organization, masters and journeymen and apprentices and so forth. Do you find any significance in these ideas in which a guild-like structure provides the motherliness that McCluskey talks about, and the human comfort that comes or can come in a commercial system that some people find lacking in competitive capitalism?
Well, you know, you're asking for a greater degree of rumination on the significance of economic history that I've probably undertaken as a philosopher. But I'd like to say that this is what I find one of the interesting things in McCluskey's work, and I think it fits into a larger narrative of hers, where she worries about, and guilds might be an example of this. On the one hand, they provide tremendous benefits in terms of solidarity and closeness among and between people, and yet on the other, that solidarity can be employed in ways that impede rather than promote the innovative process. As far as having a deep and thoughtful opinion on that, I don't know that I do. It suggests that I need to read more McCluskey. Right. Let's see. Your thoughts, fears, hoots of derision? Yes.
Between Schumpeter and Kirzner, to what extent is it an either-or proposition versus an and, or both and?
Well, I think clearly it's a both and, right? That is, we can look out at the world and we can see examples of Schumpeterian entrepreneurship. It would be silly, even as a Kirznerian, to say that never happens. And similarly, for a Schumpeterian to say of Kirznerian entrepreneurship, that never happens. The interesting question is which of these things, or which of these phenomena, when viewed through the lens of the technological project, does more to move us forward? Right? So an interesting question of economic history would be, is it trial and error Kirznerian entrepreneurship that accounts for most of the improvement in human well-being, you know, that McCluskey and others talk about, or McCluskey in Bourgeois Dignity and others as well talk about? Or is it really the case that the thing that moves us forward in terms of the technological project are these rare and precious and insightful and creative Schumpeterian entrepreneurs? I don't know, but that's an interesting question. I think it's silly to say that it's either or as an explanation of economic phenomena, but from the standpoint of trying to form public policy in a politico-economic order, right, you have to come, if not to an either or, you have to say, well, is more important than at the margin. Maybe that's the appropriate relationship between the two ideas. Does that answer or dodge your question?
No, that's good.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad I got one. Right, let's see. Other thoughts, fears. No hoots of derision. Kind of hoping for those. Let's see. Yes.
Oftentimes we follow entrepreneurship and innovation as like a way to better ourselves as a society and become more technologically savvy and capable of, you know, achieving better things. And I'm a political science major as well as a business admin major, so talk a lot about Karl Polanyi and how this flow towards market liberalism has kind of created an inevitable response that these markets are going to pull back. Do you expect to see, as we trend more towards this free market economy around the world, that it's going to deter entrepreneurship?
Well, you know, I will preface any response that I give to a question like that with never ask a philosopher an empirical question. But since you have, I mean, I think our big worry right now is that whatever are the sources of our advancement in terms of the technological project, right? Whatever are the sources, those who have succeeded have very strong incentives to try to impede others from succeeding if their success is going to put them on the destruction end of creative destruction, which is just a long way around to saying that the incentives to crony capitalism become greater as firms succeed. And we even see this with something like Uber, right? Uber, on the one hand, when Uber was small and hungry, right, it was opposed to most all regulation of taxi services and whatnot. But as it's become more established in particular markets, it starts saying, well, wait a minute, we should accede to some regulation because this will impede Lyft or one of the other startups from perhaps grabbing the slice of the pie that we have. And so I tend to think that's the bigger threat, right? That those who have achieved some success as a result of the bounty that entrepreneurial capitalism gives says, well, all right, now I want to shore up my position in the marketplace and make sure that others do not do to me what I did to others still. Again, does that dodge or in some way respond to your question? Oh, well, thank you. Okay, good. Let's see. Any other questions? Concerns? Pete.
So you did this a little on the front end, but I want to sort of push on this.
Okay.
The good, the moral, the desirable outcome of entrepreneurship. Yes, it moves us forward, but talk a little bit more on maybe the idea we were talking about earlier of sort of human flourishing and how that might play a role in how does entrepreneurship move us to these things. And I realize this is a bit more of a McCloskey sort of idea, but where does this go with us as a society from that moral, philosophical, why is this good? Why is this, aside from the fact that it gives us cool toys to play with?
That's right. Yeah, and of course, that is one way. That is one way to denigrate the technological project, right? To say, well, wait a minute, it's just shiny new stuff. You know, and some of it's good, but others of it are not. You mentioned McCloskey. The person I want to mention is Edmund Phelps, and of course his recent book, Mass Flourishing. Again, you think human action is a strange name for an economics treatise? How about mass flourishing, right? This is something that Phelps is concerned about, and Phelps tells a very entrepreneurship positive story about human flourishing, in which what he says is he likes John Rawls's thought experiment about what the just society looks like. But rather than the thought experiment being aimed at incomes or something like that, Phelps says, I'm concerned with human well-being. And he says, so let's run the thought experiment this way. Let's imagine that we can live in one of two kinds of societies. One kind of society is an entrepreneurial society. The other kind of society is a non-entrepreneurial society. He might refer to something like the social democracies of Western Europe as being examples of this model. And he says, if we're worried not about incomes, but about human well-being, he says, in a non-entrepreneurial society, the worst off people who need to be made as well off as they can be are, in fact, people with entrepreneurial personalities. Why? Because people with entrepreneurial personalities don't have an outlet in terms of which to flourish. So he says, in a non-entrepreneurial society, the worst off people are people with entrepreneurial personalities. In entrepreneurial societies, the worst off people are whoever are going to be the poorest people in entrepreneurial societies. Phelps argues that the worst off in non-entrepreneurial societies are worse off in terms of well-being than are the worst off in entrepreneurial societies in terms of well-being, and therefore and therefore we should live in entrepreneurial societies, right? So Phelps believes that entrepreneurship is a significant outlet for human flourishing, especially for people who have entrepreneurial personalities, but that in entrepreneurial societies, the people who are the worst off are better off than the people who would be the worst off in non-entrepreneurial societies. But of course, one of the worries that we might have, and I think this is something that McCloskey would speak to better than most, is that people flourish in different ways. And might not entrepreneurial societies themselves preclude, or at least make much more difficult, certain ways of living that allow some subset of the people in the society to flourish? And so that's the worry, right? That's why you say, well, wait a minute, in making our society entrepreneurial, we're permitting or we're smoothing the way for one form of human flourishing, but are we not at the same time, perhaps as a trade-off, making other ways of flourishing less available to us? Is that good? Yes, sir.
Empirically, the rate of entrepreneurship in the USA is down by 50%.
Yeah. And this is something that Phelps is really worried about, yes.
In the last 30 years. So, but on the one hand, you're also suggesting that we want limited government. So how do you stop crony capitalism without having government?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question, right? How do you stop crony capitalism? And what are the mechanisms and what are the institutions that are going to, that one, are capable of stopping crony capitalism, but that are not at the same time going to succumb to it, right? That's the predicament that we're in, right? And of course, if whoever has the answer to that one is probably going to create the most flourishing society that there ever was. I think it's very interesting the way Phelps has changed his tune, and I'm not suggesting that he's changeable, it's just he's looked at the evidence. When he won his Nobel Prize in 2006, he was very bullish on the link between entrepreneurship and innovation. But then after the real estate market crash and the financial meltdown, he looked back at the data and he says, well, when you take out all of these entrepreneurial ventures that were basically sucking the exhaust of the real estate boom, you come to find out that we're not engaging in much innovative activity at all, and the returns are really flowing to people who have political connections as opposed to people who are creating the sorts of products that permit people to flourish, right? The correct answer is I don't know, right? That's just really hard, and whoever does know is probably the person who should be standing here instead of me. Let's see, any other fears, concerns, questions, thoughts?
Can you think of an entrepreneur philosopher? There was the call for a philosopher king once upon a time. Do you think that people that are interested in entrepreneurship are generally interested in ethical and philosophical questions?
It's funny. One of the things that's interesting about being a philosopher appointed to a business school is that occasionally you meet business people generally, and entrepreneurs in particular. And one of the things that I do find is that people who are entrepreneurial do seem to care about ideas. They care about ideas not in the same way that academics do, ideas as ends in themselves, but they do seem to be very interested in ideas, particularly ideas that seem to have a practical upshot. Not merely because they have a practical upshot, but because they are. I would tend to think that a philosophical education would be an impediment to entrepreneurial undertaking for the same reason, and here's Peter Thiel talking, not just me, for the same reason that most education undermines entrepreneurial initiative, right? It encourages a risk-averse style of reasoning about what to do. So I don't know. Certainly there have been successful entrepreneurs of a philosophical cast of mind or a philosophical training. The back in the 80s we called them corporate raiders. Carl Icahn was a philosophy major at Princeton, you know, and then got involved in that. But I don't want to suggest that philosophers have any special insight into how one ought to lead an entrepreneurial life, or how best to pursue entrepreneurial success. I just hope they have something to offer to the conversation. All right. Okay. Are we there?
Well, if not, let's again take one more opportunity to thank.
Thank you. Thank you very much.